I hope and trust that at this point through the series that the overarching theme is clear to you. This ongoing historical tension that disciples have felt between resistance to the cultural norms and the way culture does its business, and thus developing a kind of reformist strategy in order to transform culture in more Christian ways, versus another model which is more selective in its appropriation or adaptation of certain cultural norms, and here you have accommodationist rather than reformist strategies. And I hope and trust that it's also clear that the narrative of America's religious history that I've tried to portray over the last 4 sessions doesn't really have one set, whether you're talking about the reformist types or the accommodationist types. Neither one of those, I think, wears the white hat, and the other side wears the black hat. I don't want to leave the impression that one side's the good guys and the other side's the bad guys, because life is just not that simple. And the struggles are always more nuanced than that. They're more complex and difficult. Both models, both strategies are filled with pros and cons, right? You can sort of sympathize with one side, and yet some people from that strategy or that model or that group, you say, oh, I'm not sure I'd go there with them. So some of the reformer types can be praised because they do lead society to a higher level of prophetic challenge. So I have, for example, the utmost respect for people like the Puritans, or last week it was Samuel Worcester or Frederick Douglass, those people who really put their lives on the line, and they don't worry about the cost. It's the mission, it's the service, it's the greater good that inspires them. And yet, among some, the reformers can get a little trite, and perhaps even silly and dangerous from time to time, and we saw a few of them last week. And on the other hand, you got the accommodationists who achieve a level of effective, efficient service and really put something into society. And so I appreciate the George Whitefield or the Charles Grandison Finneys, because through their efforts you do get a kind of re-churching of America at key moments. And so they keep religion vital in American history and society, and yet some from that accommodationist strategy, they get a little cavalier, sometimes a little undiscerning about how much they can swallow from society. And so the goal here in looking at this is to create a desire for a lifelong commitment to embracing the struggle, to realizing that it's not something new, but it's something very old, and that we have inherited this and we really can't avoid it. And yet, it is a difficult situation, and it's not just an either-or choice. So ultimately, what I hope we come away with is a God-inspired consciousness and appreciation and a quest for wisdom on how we as disciples can embrace this challenge and live and learn in respectful, helpful ways, both in service to God and to our fellow human beings. So if you think about it in that way, history really isn't just stories from our past. You know, it's not that stuff that's behind us. Because you know what, if you think about it, people like the Charles Grandison Finneys or the George Whitefield or the Puritans, they all wrestled with issues and they struggled with questions that may be in your future. They've already wrestled with things that you haven't yet experienced. And so, in an ironic way, people from the past are actually in our future. And they've already wrestled with the questions we're going to encounter sometime ahead of us. And their wisdom is waiting for us. And when we get there, if we listen, they will teach us. So hopefully that makes the history meaningful and purposeful. That it's not just nice anecdotes and trivial stuff, that if you're ever finding yourself in a chair opposite of Regis, you might happen to know the answer to that question. You know, it's not just trivial anecdotal stuff, but there may be wisdom for us for the future, waiting for us out there that we can tap into. So, we do hopefully learn from this. And what I want to talk about tonight is a moment in America's experience, maybe a little over 100 years ago, when culture really challenged them deeply again. And that seems to be a constant theme here, right? Every time they think they got it figured out or might have a model, what do I do with this new challenge? Well, the time period sometimes referred to as the Gilded Age represented some of these big challenges. Because up until the Gilded Age, America was a fairly small society, all things considered population-wise. There was a lot of territory, but there weren't that many people. It was not a particularly wealthy country in comparison to some European countries. It was distinctively rural. Most people lived out away from cities. And it was not a strong nation, politically, militarily. We tend to forget that even up through almost two-thirds of the 19th century, the United States was not a world military player. In fact, around 1870, the United States ranked 12th among world military powers, right behind Bulgaria. You know, that sort of puts you in your place there, right? You weren't going to control the situation. The situation might control you. But what happens during the Gilded Age is that America changes. One of the first things you see is a real growth in the urbanization of American society. 1870, sort of the beginning of the Gilded Age, 75% of all Americans, 3/4 of all Americans, lived in rural settings. So that was what influenced your life. You know, you knew your neighbors. They often were extended family. That influenced the way you did church, because Mom, Dad, the kids, they had gone to that church for generations. Well, now, you move forward through the Gilded Age period and into the early 20th century, and by 1930, now 56% of all Americans live in cities. So you go from 3/4 of all Americans living in the country now to over half of Americans living in cities, and they're big cities, and they're crowded cities. For example, one ward of New York City, the 10th ward of New York City, had a population where 522 people lived on an acre. 522 people per acre, and this is before indoor plumbing and a lot of the creature comforts that we come to appreciate. That's a difference, living from where you got lots of elbow room to where you're uptight and personal with lots of other people. In conjunction with that, now America is increasingly an industrialized society. The industrial output of America booms during this moment. Between 1870 and 1930, manufacturing employment grew over 400%, and America's industrial output increased over 1,000%. Well, that work structure changed the course of life. If you lived out in the farm, you were often your own boss, or at least a relative was your boss. Now, in an industrialized setting, when the whistle blew, you hit the time clock and you went to work, and you worked until another whistle blew and they let you go. Your life was at their disposal. You didn't have the autonomy that you used to have. Well, this also generated an economic expansion in American society. By the time you get right into the 20th century, America now is the world's #1 industrial economy. Going from a kind of also-ran country to now the world's #1 economic power changed things. Americans started seeing themselves a little differently. America had the world's richest man for the first time, Andrew Carnegie, and he'd made a lot of money. He took home, at his peak, right before he sold his business, he took home a paycheck of $500,000 per week. And that's like in 1900. The estimate is you multiply that by about $13, $1 then for $13 now to get a sense of what that means. He's making close to $6 million a week. That's impressive. And following on his heels, you'll have John D. Rockefeller, the world's first billionaire. So America not only has big cities, it's got a lot of cash and some big spenders. Business was generating extreme amounts of wealth, and that generated kind of consumer mentality, a passion to buy. This new economy didn't really value thrift and frugality, the life of simplicity. If this new booming economy was going to keep running, people had to keep buying because that would generate jobs. And so people started seeing themselves in relation to the society in different ways. Conspicuous consumption became something of a pastime. Some of these characters, like the Andrew Carnegies or the Rockefellers, actually used to dream up ways to show their wealth. So they would do parties, for example. But everybody did parties, so how do you outdo the last party that somebody else had? Well, on one occasion, they decided to bring in horses so that they could all eat their fine cuisine on horseback inside the house. Why? Because their house was big enough and they could afford to do that. America was a different place early in the 20th century. And with that newfound wealth and economic power came military power. The United States became a world player because if you got a lot of cash, you might need a military to defend. Now that you own something you want to defend. So America was different. And the question increasingly came to Christians, what do we do with that? Is that okay? Have we changed too much? Have we embraced a kind of cultural phenomenon that is somehow another antithetical to the Christian message? What do we do with success, wealth, and power? Are we supposed to embrace it as a gift of God? That God has invested this in us and we are stewards of these blessings of God for greater service to humanity? Or are we supposed to stand back from this and give the prophetic call and say, no, we've lost something, we've sold our souls? What do we do? How do we accept this? Well, in many ways, the church, early in the 20th century, started embracing this. And it's not hard to understand why. Because, to throw some more statistics at you, statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics, so I'll give you some more statistics here. In 1870, again, sort of at the beginning of this transition, the church took in about 10% of what the U.S. government did. So if you're just sort of creating a comparison here. The U.S. government takes in X amount. The church, what it took in per year would be about a tenth of that. By 1916, the church was taking in 50% of what the U.S. government took in. So yeah, there was a lot of wealth out there, and the church was getting a pretty fair slice of that action. The church was becoming a wealthy enterprise, and that was attractive. And when they took that, when they embraced that, the life and work of the church had to change. There was more money. How do you manage that? Can you do it the way you used to do it? So increasingly, American churches started borrowing strategies from the business world. They started emphasizing institutionalization and professionalization. Now that we have all this money, we better be good stewards of it. So you couldn't have the little, I guess for lack of a better word, the mom and pop ministry. The parachurch organization that ran on a shoestring budget, and they kind of got around to worrying about the finances when they had a chance. You couldn't do that. Now you had to do it the way John D. Rockefeller ran his business. You had people looking after these things and making sure you had a steady cash flow to maintain the business and the work. And so they did start mimicking the business philosophies. You see, in the 19th century, a lot of times when there was a ministry, they would have a special Sunday. We're going to hold a big collection one time a year. This collection is going to go to that particular ministry. And that was it for the year. But now, because that business strategy really wasn't wise, they started using more well-organized, multi-year pledge drives so that you could sustain a cash flow over a course of time. Use lots of hefty advertisement. And focus on the mega gift. Find a really big donor, and then you don't have to worry about all the nickels and dimes from the little donors. And create an endowment so that you can set that aside and know what you've got before you enter into the business or budget year. Business strategies as ways to do ministry. One Congregationalist urged when he was reporting to his finance agency, his church finance agency, quote, "Nothing should be left to chance. At no point have we trusted that the Lord will provide." Every time I read that, I just stop and almost gasp. Nothing should be left to chance. At no point have we trusted that the Lord will provide. So much for providence. So much for waiting on the leading of God. We're just going to make sure we've got what we need, and if God's in the picture or not, well, we'll figure that out later. And it worked on one level. Not only was the church's wealth growing faster, these methods allowed churches to beat inflation by 30% a year. So if the graph is going up, the church line on that graph is going up at a steeper angle. They're beating inflation. They're doing well. Well, imagine how that changed the life and work of the church. Just the very experience of it. The way in which I suggested you have this kind of institutionalization of the church. Because now the local congregation became sort of the sales wing of the denomination. They're out there on the front line. They bring in the money, they channel that money to the main office, and the main office then distributes it to the various agencies to do the work of the church. The standing or the role of the church became much less. And it was increasingly out of the hands of the average member of the church and into the hands of the people who ran the bureaucracy. For example, Charles Stelzel wrote a book in 1908 entitled The Principles of Successful Church Advertising. How are we going to do this right? How are we going to do this best? And he said that churches must adopt what business has proven. Innovative, artistic, systematic, and emotional appeals gain people's attention. Use the advertising tactics that work. I don't know if anybody saw the Frontline episode last night on PBS. They were talking about, it was entitled, I think, Cool Hunting, where advertisers go out and try to find out what is cool now, because what is cool will sell. Well, that's what they were doing in 1908. And how do you use advertising to connect with the people who are out there and who will consume what you have to offer? Stelzel argued, for example, one of the things that the church ought to do, and this is 1908, electric signs. Because that will grab people's attention. People will see those. Now, a couple of people, when they read this, were horrified. Because if you think about it, who in 1908 was using electrified signs? That was vaudeville. And now, here you have Stelzel saying, that'll work. It works for vaudeville. It'll work for the church. And people started wondering, is that what the church has come to? We're sort of a sanctified vaudeville? I don't know. Well, the other part of the story was, when you get them into the church building, they better like what they hear and what they see. They've got to be comfortable if they're going to stay. Well, that depends then on who you're trying to reach, because not everybody likes the same thing, right? Some people like one brand and somebody else likes another. So if you're going to be a successful church, now you've got to target an audience and work specifically for that group, because you can't get them all. The emphasis on the church can't be that inclusive. So you have a guy, for example, in Nashville named Landon Garland, a Southern Methodist spokesman who fretted that if discomfort and filth was vital to the proclamation of the gospel, well, then the Southern Methodists would have a monopoly on the Great Commission, because he thought they were a little too, well, they just weren't refined sufficiently at this point. He longed to see, quote, long drawn aisles, fretted vaults, and fluted columns, sanctuaries in harmony with the refinement of cultivated tastes of society. He didn't want to go to church where it was common. He wanted to go to church where it was absolutely stunning and beautiful. And he wondered how Southern Methodists could ever attract the better class of society to their congregation if the Southern Methodists couldn't break from that old frontier identity and that hayseed image. People are moving to town and cleaning up. The church better move to town and clean up too, is what he was saying. He said, look, the people, the wealthy at their homes, they have carpets and paintings and Mozart and Beethoven playing in the background, and they go to church on Sunday morning and they have rough-hewn pews, tobacco-stained floors that would defile the rich person's clothing, and music that is, quote, discordant and without single quality to enforce the sentiments of the poetry. He continued, what disgust must fulfill the cultivated mind under circumstances like these? Repulsion is the necessary consequence. And so he wanted to change the way the church building looked, what people would hear, and what they would see, especially to refine them. And he wanted to change the role of the minister as well. Interesting quote from Landon Garland. Quote, it is shocking to see a minister in the pulpit in garb that would mortify us in the parlor. Linen soiled, collar opened, neck without a tie, vest not reaching to the waistband, exposing the underclothes, shoes unpolished, coat unbrushed, and unclerical in cut and color. And I was like, just how rude can we be to have that preacher up there on Sunday morning in that attire? He should know better. He should do better. He continued that he was disposed to question any man's religion that does not embrace soap and water. Clean up, you know. This is what we've got to do. And one of the reasons why I raise this is because Landon Garland and a few others thought that if the New South was going to be a New South and embrace the wealth and opportunity of the New South, that preachers needed better training. They needed refinement. They needed a refining school. And so they created seminaries, not so much to teach them Greek and Hebrew and theology, but to teach them how to clean up and look good in society. And so Landon Garland and a few others created the Vanderbilt Divinity School as a way to train up preachers who would look right and project the right image in a refined society. Well, la-ti-da. But that's kind of what they're after. They didn't want that old frontier image anymore. And they got that from guys like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who had encouraged the well-to-do to be good stewards of their paternalistic role, to sort of project the right image, to set the right standards, to lead society in the right paths, to provide, as Andrew Carnegie would say, ladders to social betterment. Not charity, but ladders, inspiration, if you will. Well, one of the things you had to do was to alter, perhaps, the image of Jesus in this. Could you still embrace the old understanding of Jesus in this new business climate? And one of the individuals who helped make that transition and bring Jesus, if you will, into the 20th century, at least for popular consumption, was a guy named Bruce Barton, who was an advertising man. His most famous book was The Man Nobody Knows. And in the beginning of it, he said, you got to sell Jesus like you sell soap. a lot of soap in this, isn't there? There seems to be a fixation here. I don't know what it is. But he was saying, the same way that you would sell soap to consumers, that's the way you sell Jesus. He said, if you think about it, in this rough and tumble, survival of the fittest society, Jesus better be ready for the fight. And so he, in his book, The Man Nobody Knows, removed what he called the weak and sissified Jesus, the one who always looks kind of drawn and weak and pale, and replaced him with a man's man. He said Jesus' muscles were made of iron because he was an outdoorsman. He lived outdoors, traveled outdoors with men. You know, this is a guy who could carry his weight. He was a carpenter. Not only that, at the same time, he could fit into the social scene in Palestine real well. He got invited to the parties. And he was the best, Jesus, the best ad man of the day. Hold public's attention, create excitement, always knew how to work the marketplace. He said, look at him. Jesus took 12 illiterate guys and made the world's greatest multinational corporation. One that has survived all kinds of challenges. Well, that really shouldn't surprise us, Bruce Barton said, because Jesus told his own parents when they came looking for him in the temple, don't you know I must be about my Father's business? That even Jesus taught, embraced the business. So the popular notion was at the time, the essential logic is that wealth and capital was a potential good. Use it in the right ways, it will achieve the right objectives. Let me tell you one more story of an individual, and I'll wrap up with this. Because perhaps the guy who really illustrates this so successfully was a guy named Russell Conwell. Russell Conwell, you know, you've heard of preachers who don't have a large repertoire. Russell Conwell basically had one sermon. It was entitled Acres of Diamonds. He gave this one sermon over 6,000 times. Would travel all over the country with this one sermon and get paid for it every time. And by the time he retired, he had cleared $8 million off of one sermon. And what he's saying is, and I have a little quote from it here, I say, this is getting near the end of it, I say you ought to get rich. It is your Christian duty to get rich. Now, how many of my pious brethren say to me, do you, a Christian minister, spend your time going up and down the country advising young people to get rich, to get money? Yes, of course I do. Well, they say that's awful. Why don't you preach the gospel instead of preaching about man's making money? Because to make money is to preach the gospel. And what he's saying here is, to sort of update it, if you can convert one Bill Gates, that will do a whole lot more than creating lots of John and Jane Does. Because everybody pays attention to what Bill Gates does. Everybody follows the lead of what Bill Gates does. Everyone follows the cash of Bill Gates. So if you can get the rich, powerful person and convert him, then the rest of society will follow. And so you'll have revivalist preachers like Dwight L. Moody and Samuel Jones changing their emphasis and trying to connect with the rich and the famous, the powerful, the successful, because they can underwrite their enterprises and they can lend them a level of status that they couldn't earn on their own. So I wrap up with a quote from Bishop Lawrence, I don't think any relation to Dr. Lawrence, we'll have to check on this, who probably put this business philosophy most succinctly when he announced, quote, godliness is in league with riches. Material prosperity is helping to make the national character sweeter, more joyous, more unselfish, more Christ-like. Is he right? Is this logic right? Is this the way to address the cultural opportunities of the moment, or have they crossed the line? That's the question we have to wrestle with.